100 years of unity. Nigeria, we will stand. We will stand.
Oh, this land of mine.
This land of mine.
Nigeria, on my mind.
On my mind.
I pledge to you my loyalty,
My love,
my ability.
Ooh, and as we celebrate ourselves, we shall.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for 2023's special lecture in African Studies. It is my privilege to welcome you on Penn's behalf, and we're honored that His Excellency, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, Vice President of Nigeria, will present the lecture in just a few minutes. I want to first acknowledge and thank the Center for Africana Studies, Center Director Professor Camille Charles, and her team for sponsoring and coordinating our lecture today. Our co-sponsors include Penn Global and Perry Worldhouse, Penn Carey Law School, the Wharton Coalition for Equity and Opportunity, and the Wharton African Student Association. And of course, special thanks to our host, the Penn Museum. Thank you all for your support. A Yoruba proverb says that only the thing for which you have struggled will last. Today, our planet is in an existential struggle against climate change. For our Earth, indeed for us, to last, we must join with our fellow nations around the world in this struggle. Like many countries, including the United States, Nigeria is challenged by competing and sometimes conflicting interests, and its development prospects are complex. The country is home to Africa's largest population, its largest economy, and what's said to be its largest city, Lagos. Nigeria also holds among the continent's largest proven oil reserves. Yet it's also facing a potentially perilous future of climate-induced sea level rise and drought. In short, global progress in the battle against climate change needs Nigeria's partnership and participation. As Vice President Osinbajo noted last year in The Economist, the challenge for the continent is to transition to net zero emissions, while at the same time building sustainable power systems to drive development and economic opportunity. This will be the subject of his talk this afternoon. Through research and innovation, universities, and Penn in particular, play a critical role in fighting climate change. Our Environmental Innovations Initiative, the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, the Global Shifts program at Perry Worldhouse, combined with academic programs in design, engineering, chemistry, and human health, among other fields, are addressing the causes and effects of a warming planet. Yet our role is much broader than the creation of technical solutions. We educate future leaders and global citizens, instilling the value and importance of sustainability and stewardship in everyday life. Some of you may know that Penn and Nigeria have a strong and long connection. In 1963, Penn President Gaylord Harnwell sent a cablegram to Nigeria congratulating the University of Nigeria on its first ever graduating class. Later that year, the founder of that university, Nnamdi Azikiwe, would become the president of the First Republic of Nigeria and a driving force behind its independence. And the Quaker connection? He earned his master's degree in anthropology right here at Penn, and probably in this very building. Class of 1933, if you're wondering. Today, we have hundreds of alumni in Nigeria, and several dozen Nigerian students are enrolled at Penn. Vice President Osinbajo himself has more than a passing familiarity with academia. Educated at the University of Lagos and the London School of Economics, early in his career, he lectured in law at the University of Lagos and later joined the faculty as professor of law. He has been an outspoken supporter of sustainable energy for developing nations when combined with reasonable expectations for its adoption. And Penn is honored to host him this afternoon. Once again, welcome. And it's now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Tukufu Zuberi. Tukufu is the Lazary Family Professor of Race Relations and Professor of Sociology and Africana Studies at Penn. And he will introduce the Vice President this afternoon. Tukufu.
Good afternoon, everybody. How y'all doing? You know, I just spent a few minutes talking to His Excellency, the Vice President, and it was definitely a rewarding conversation. And so I want to welcome you, Your Excellency, Vice President Osinbajo, the President of the and we have the provost of the university, and all of you for making this moment, taking this moment in your time to come and participate in this conversation. On behalf of the Center for Africana Studies, I am pleased to welcome you all to our special lecture in African Studies with the generous support of the Office of the President of the University. Our special lectures follows the Distinguished Lecture in African Studies series we started in 2022. The first in the series was delivered by the first Black person to win the Nobel Peace Prize in literature, Nigerian Professor Wole Soyinka. And last month, we hosted the President Masisi of the Federal Republic of Botswana. So we're trying to make big moves in Africa. I hope y'all can see that, right? This is what we're doing here. Now we're particularly excited to welcome Vice President Osinbajo of the Republic of Nigeria. Our relationship with Nigeria, as you just heard, actually extends back past the 1930s, but crystallized in the 1930s with Ezekwe, who would become Nigeria's first president, who graduated, as you were just told, in 1933. Since that time, President Ezekwe, as you know, since his time at Penn, he matriculated as a student. Since that time, Nigeria has thrown off the chains of colonialism and become one of the most politically and economically important places on the African continent, indeed in the world. I should also mention that Philadelphia is itself the home to a very large African diaspora, and particularly a very large diaspora population from Nigeria. So you can feel kind of at home. Not totally, but kind of at home, you know. Kind of like those, you know, Edo statues we got back there. Get comfortable, but don't get too comfortable, because you might be needing to go back home soon. So we're celebrating 50 years of Black Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And so it is important for us to interrogate the global black world. Too often, Africa is only mentioned when discussing tired tropes and are omitted from serious discussions of climate change, of the role of China in the world and in Africa, and of all of the transformations that we witness going on in our world today. Africa, in many ways, has not been treated fairly in conversations. Often, this treatment is a result of simply not understanding Africa. So that's general across the board with Africa. I mean, you got some people who will say, well, look, you got an Africa collection and an Egypt collection. And we say you got an Africa collection with objects from Egypt and objects from Nigeria and objects from all these other places. I keep bringing up these things because we're in the museum, y'all. Today we are honored by His Excellency. In addition to being a pastor, he is an accomplished scholar and thought leader in Nigeria. He earned his LLB degree from the University of Lagos and a Master's of Law from the London School of Economics. Vice President Osinbajo has served as the Senior Advocate of Law, SAN, Professor of Law, and until his inauguration as Vice President, was a senior partner with Simons Cooper Partners, a commercial law firm, and a leading global practice and business solution provider. He has won several awards throughout his career, published numerous articles and books on legal matters, and was conferred the Grand Commander of the Order of Nigeria. Today, he will discuss climate change and a just transition. Following his lecture, His Excellency will be joined for a conversation with our Professor Wale, Presidential Penn Compact Professor of Africana Studies. His scholarship focuses on social mobilization and interest in Africa and the state and civil society, of media and social theory. And I've learned a lot from this guy. Just kind of, you know, some of these dudes, you talk to him and you leave out of the room, you say, I better not tell him how much I learned. He might not let me back in the room. Be telling me, go see me in the classroom. But he has really given me a different sensibility to the politics and the internal workings of the politics and leadership in Nigeria. So I really do look forward to this conversation. I expect it to provide a lot of energy for us. So if you will, please join me in welcoming Vice President Osinbajo as he comes to the stage to present his lecture.
Thank you very much, Provost Beth Winkelston and Professor Tukufu Zuberi, and all of the very kind and hospitable professors and friends and colleagues that I've met within the past hour or so. Thank you very much. I mean, I think the hospitality was so warm that I really felt that I ought to have been here a lot sooner. I really must thank you very much, and also for the tour of the museum. That was really quite an eye-opener. Thank you very much indeed. I'm also grateful to the the Center for Africana Studies of the University of Pennsylvania for the kind invitation to speak on energy transition in Africa. As a matter of fact, the topic is actually energy transition in Africa, although there will be components of a just transition. I have in the past few months both in speaking and even writing about this and related issues, been thinking or perhaps approaching the subject from the point of view of a just transition, which perhaps explains why the topic displayed is energy transition, the just transition. That is the broad notion that the burdens of climate change and its mitigation must be fairly and equitably shared between African countries who are, as we all know, the least emitters, but the worst sufferers of the consequences, and of course the least prepared for the consequences of climate change, and the developed economies who, of course, we know are the worst emitters and who are far better resourced to deal with the consequences of climate change. But while this climate justice point of view is crucial, that is the concept of a just transition, while it's important, it nevertheless often leads to the conclusion that the only options open to Africa are adaptation and lately loss and damage compensation. In other words, almost every conversation around a just transition would almost invariably lead to saying, well, the solution is some adaptation and perhaps some compensation in terms of loss and damage. So for African countries, the remedy that climate justice often appears to present is rather narrow. Adaptation or loss or damage, as I've said. But for African countries, a challenge that is as important as containing climate change is energy poverty, which essentially means the lack of access to energy for electricity, for cooking, for heating, for cooling, etc., and how this inhibits any real chances of growth or job opportunities. Of course, we all know from empirical evidence that the availability of energy directly correlates with income, wealth, and development, both at the individual and the societal level. And the energy poverty issue in Africa, as I'm sure some of us are already aware, is huge. Over 1.3 billion people in Africa are serviced by an installed capacity of about 244 gigawatts, which is less than the 248 gigawatts that 83 million Germans have access to. So sub-Saharan Africa remains also the only region in the world which has the largest number now of people without access to clean cooking fuels and technologies. 19 out of the 20 countries within the lowest clean cooking access rates are in Africa. So for Africa, the crucial question in the energy transition conversation is, how does the continent develop? How does the continent provide well-paying jobs and decent livelihoods for its growing population within the globally agreed carbon constraints? And those carbon constraints, as you know, are the Paris Agreements, the Kigali Accord, more recently, the Kyoto Protocol for Developed Economies, and renewed energy standards, etc. Those are the constraints that we've all agreed to stay within. The straight answer is that there does not seem to be a pathway. There isn't a pathway for Africa to provide for its populations, provide well-paying jobs, provide opportunities, etc., if we stay within the globally agreed constraints. This is because the historical pathway of growth to upper middle income status that has been attained today by the wealthier countries of the world was by the use of carbon-intensive energy sources. But such a growth path is not available to African countries, at least not within the global planetary boundaries. The global carbon budget, as they say, simply would not allow it. Please bear with me. There are a few sustainability jargons that I might use, and I'm sure that only those of us who are interested enough in climate change may be aware of some of these jargon. But global planetary boundaries, for example, refers to the concept, was developed just in 2009, that there are certain limits or thresholds in the Earth's natural systems that, if crossed, could lead to irreversible changes and potentially catastrophic consequences for human civilization and the biosphere as a whole. So those boundaries which we've set, the planetary boundaries which we've set for ourselves, we assume that if Africa were to go the same pathway of carbon-intensive development, then, of course, it would be impossible for us to, for the rest of the world, to reach its targets for zero carbon emissions by 2050 and all of that. As a matter of fact, some of the information that we have, or some of the research that has been done, shows that if Africa were to go the same carbon-intensive path as wealthier countries have gone, it could add actually 12 gigatons of CO2e emissions annually by 2050. And that, of course, will put global net zero by that time well outside of reach. So if all we did was to just go the same pathway, just do the same things that everyone else has done to get to upper middle income status, then it will be impossible for the world to achieve net zero by 2050. So the inconvenient truth here, if one may borrow that expression, is that beyond being treated as victims, whose problems will be dealt with somewhere later on in the food chain, Africa's own growth and development is not really being seriously accommodated in the global energy transition conversation. It just isn't. Yet, a strategic key to attaining global net zero by 2050 may well lie in seeing Africa from a different paradigm, not merely as a victim, but possibly as a solution. And I've been greatly helped in coming to this conclusion by the involvement that I've had in recent months with some of the very great work of advocacy and proof of concept that's been done by James Wangi and Carly Nowen, who form what is called the Climate Action for Africa, or CAP-A. And they've done quite great work in this area. And I've taken a lot from a lot of their conclusions, a lot of work they've done in my material for this particular presentation. So beyond climate justice, beyond just saying Africa is a victim, let's take care of that problem, may lie a real opportunity for Africa and the world. And this opportunity is the distinct possibility of climate positive growth for Africa. In other words, a paradigm where Africa pursues a climate positive or carbon negative path to middle income status and beyond. And of course, there's really no difference between climate positive or carbon negative. They mean one and the same thing. And this contains in and of itself part of the solution to the global net zero ambitions of the world. Because if, as is the case, some countries will not meet their net zero targets by 2050, then some significant portion of the world must be climate positive or net negative for global net zero to be achievable. Put differently, since many regions are already off track to achieve net zero by 2050, some other regions must fill the gap. If global targets must be met, some other regions must fill that gap. A recently released IPCC report notes that greenhouse gas emissions from human activities have already made our world 1.10 centigrade warmer. And we are, as a global community, not on track to limit warming to 1.50 degrees centigrade or 2 degrees centigrade, as targeted under the Paris agreements. So Africa, with its current low carbon footprints and limited legacy infrastructure, is in the best position to do that. Let's just examine that argument more closely. Africa's endowments, renewable energy, natural resources, and a young workforce present a compelling set of circumstances for several pathways to climate positive growth. Now, these pathways include the following. The first, is a low emissions consumption and production. Low emissions consumption and production. I'm going to come back to that. The point being that Africa can, instead of going the carbon intensive path to providing energy, goods, and services for its own needs, can actually take full advantage of green technologies and practices. There's the distinct advantage that Africa can actually pursue a green course of growth without worrying about costly legacy infrastructure. This would, of course, mean a wide range of changes in eating, living, city designs, for instance, transportation, the use of electric cars. Different changes in habits must occur. And of course, there's so many things going on already, of course. An example is a project in Kenya with the use of low-cost bioethanol-fueled cook stoves. These are already in use with an offtake reaching, as of 2021, almost 300,000 of these cook stoves, up from about 50,000 just 2 years earlier. And it's estimated that this could mean over 1 million metric tons of CO2e in avoided emissions annually, just using these cook stoves, just using this number of cook stoves. Of course, that can increase. It can increase every year. It can increase to any number. And then there's the additional benefit that the stoves generate high-quality carbon credits, which are sold in the global carbon markets. The second pathway is that having recognized the fact that global zero carbon ambitions cannot be realized without intentional carbon removal technologies and practices, Africa can actually ramp up her own potential to remove carbon at scale through a combination of planned land use and ecosystem management and the engineered removal technologies. Already, Africa's large carbon sinks currently store years of global emissions, and the abundant supply of unused agricultural waste is already available as biomass for clean energy production and soil improvement. The third pathway is that with its abundant reserves of renewable energy and raw materials, Africa can become a hugely competitive green manufacturing and energy hub for the world that could actually accelerate greening of global industry. For example, by onshore processing of 110 million tons of bauxite to aluminum, and that is currently being exported as raw bauxite from Africa to Europe and Asia. But doing this using renewable energy, between 1.3 to 1.5 gigatons of CO2e emissions can be avoided annually just by doing the processing onshore, just by processing bauxite onshore. You can actually save that much in CO2e emissions. And that is the same as processing lithium within the mining locality. Already some of that is happening. In Kaduna, for example, in Nigeria, there's a lithium processing factory which has been built. The whole idea, of course, is that aside from mining the lithium will also be processed onshore. Zimbabwe recently, also in December 2022, introduced its own policy on local processing of lithium. So Africa also has the technical potential to produce 21 billion tons worth of hydrogen annually, as compared to Europe's potential of 0.67 billion tons. And as green hydrogen costs fall, African manufacturing locations may become even more competitive in a range of related value chains, for example, for ammonia, for fertilizers, and e-fuels as well. So the paradox, if you like, of an energy-poor continent becoming the green industrial powerhouse of the world is easily resolvable, and it must be. Energy poverty can only be resolved if there is a significant investment in renewable energy. That can only happen if we create the energy-intense anchor demand that makes the investment in additional renewable energy bankable. We have to create that anchor demand to make that additional investment bankable. Therefore, it is not which comes first. It's not whether renewable energy generation capacity comes first or industrial deployment comes first. Both must be developed concurrently. With industrial anchor demand, African countries can make the grid investments and create the cross-subsidy opportunities to serve the unserved and underserved retail users. In addressing energy poverty, it is much more straightforward than some of what we're made to believe. So the purported choice between expanded retail energy access and industrial development is a false one, because industrial development will make investments in retail access possible. So it's not one or the other, it's actually both working together. How about the dependence of countries like mine, like Nigeria, on oil and gas, and of course the implications of that for emissions? I think that the use of gas as a transition fuel, and I emphasize transition fuel, will not significantly derail our commitment to carbon negative growth. Nigeria's energy transition plan attempts to chart an energy transition pathway which has at its bedrock the development of renewable energy, specifically solar energy. The plan is to develop 250 gigawatts of solar capacity by 2050. And that plan outlines the decarbonization strategies in the area of power, oil and gas, transportation, etc. It also mitigates against the medium to long-term job losses in an industry that has dominated our economy for decades. So we have to take account of that also. What do we do with the job losses? And our energy transition plan takes that into account. It also recommends the role of gas as a transition fuel to balance large influxes of solar power on the grid. It's also, of course, a cheaper and relatively cleaner option for base load power, for industry. So today, just to explain that as quickly as possible, today, renewable energy has not been shown to have sufficient base load to power industry. Of course, you need loads and loads of renewable energy to be able to do so, but gas has that base load. And besides, gas is useful also to ensure that the grid remains steady when you're using multiple sources of energy. And all of this, of course, is happening as we watch the cost of solar batteries plunge. And indeed, the cost of solar batteries, the cost is actually plunging. And even in the past 10 years alone, the past 5 years even, we've seen a tremendous drop in the price of solar batteries, and we expect that will happen and continue to happen. There are also practical ways in which gas, especially propane, will bridge the gap before the full use of renewables is commercially practical. To illustrate the point, recently some discussions have been going on decommissioning of industrial scale diesel and petrol generators that are used at the moment by base station operators of telecommunications companies in Nigeria. So the telecommunications companies have these operators who operate their base stations, the base stations they use for their systems. And thousands of these base stations are powered 24/7 by diesel generators. So a proposal that was made for complete replacement of these diesel generators with solar power and batteries met with a challenge. The service level agreements that the base station operators have with the telcos is simple. We just want 24/7 power, no downtime. That's the service level agreement. Now, using solar power alone today with necessary storage facilities will be far too expensive. So the compromise that may now be reached, and as I said, the conversation is ongoing, is that we'll start as an interim measure until the cost of solar batteries, of course, reduce sufficiently. We'll start with a hybrid power source, solar energy and propane-powered generators. Propane, as I've said, is a much lower carbon emitter than diesel or petrol, and propane or LPG is already in use for clean cooking stoves in Nigeria and in several different parts of Africa. So there are many practical short-term uses of gas that are made more attractive because of its availability and relative cleanness as compared to other fossil fuels. So considering the three pathways to climate positive growth that I've outlined, and I'll just repeat them in case anyone has fallen asleep while I was, talking. The first is Africa pursuing an essentially green course of growth, low emission consumption and production. That's the first pathway. The second is Africa being the carbon removal center of the world, both by offering natural carbon sinks, which we have in abundance already, and the development of carbon removal technologies. The third is becoming the most competitive green manufacturing and energy hub for the world. The proposition that Africa could then bring to the table, or if you like, a grand bargain that Africa and the international community may make is as follows: a climate positive growth framework based on the premise that the world needs Africa to attain its net zero ambitions. Just to elaborate, a climate positive growth framework is also both an answer to the global need for massively net negative emissions in order to attain its net zero ambitions. And at the same time, is a solution to Africa's growth imperatives: energy access, jobs, and decent livelihoods for millions. Now, the success of this framework will depend on certain key actions, some of which are within the control of African states and others the control of the international community. On their part, African countries will formulate clear science-based national strategies for climate positive growth. The strategies will be linked to specific targets for net negative contributions to global emissions. There must also be accompanying policy and regulatory environment that will enable the realization of the strategy, and by such means encourage needed investments. For this, we can build on the Kigali Accord, which is an accord which has moved us several steps further, especially after Paris and the agreements following it. The international community, on its part, will undertake to make the required investments in Africa's renewable energy and work out trade rules that will give access to favor low emissions production and also facilitate the rapid development of fair and equitable carbon markets. And that's quite an issue by itself, although that's, and I won't want to take you too much, of course, but equitable, fair and just carbon markets are important. I work at the moment with the African Carbon Markets Initiative, and part of our tasks is to see how we can actually deal with the rest of the world, to work out, fair systems by which the African carbon markets could operate effectively. Africa, from which highly competitive carbon returns will come, can only see the capital influx if the bottlenecks to fully functional carbon markets, such as verification, etc., are worked on. At the moment, most of the verifying bodies, the bodies that verify carbon credits, that verify the value of carbon credits, of course, are based in the global northern countries. But if Africa is going to be the hub for many of these useful carbon credits, then we need to have much more verification companies actually located in Africa. The international community must also ensure some degree of market access to African countries, so we can sell low embedded emission products into the global markets in an equitable way. And the financing for this purpose ought to be appropriately nuanced to surmount a lot of the competition inhibiting risk premiums and cost of capital challenges that Africa faces. A good mix of development finance will be important, alongside patient and flexible financing instruments some of which have been used successfully already for financing renewables. There are many options aside from the conventional. We have renewable auctions, and these are taking place practically all over the world now, including Africa. Debt for climate swaps are being proposed, and of course, carbon markets. There are, of course, very many practical issues to be worked out if this grand bargain is to happen, including intermittency of solar and wind power, the systems integration issues, cost of storage of renewable energy, financing, and of course the notoriously difficult problems around changing global trade rules, etc. But these are challenges that can, with a clear sense of the existential urgency of the goals that we want to achieve, be surmounted. And the incentive to make these proposals work is the recognition that Africa can actually be the key to meeting the global net zero targets that we've set for ourselves. Thank you very much for listening. To the global ambitions of net zero by 2050. But perhaps that may not even be as difficult as making the necessary investments. Because, okay, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious that Africa is indeed the key. Or perhaps the question is, how do you make those investments? What's the order of magnitude of those investments? And frankly, I think that these are issues that can be worked out. These are issues that can be dealt with, but the conversations must start. You know, the engagements must begin.
Yeah, there are some important differences among those who are concerned with the challenges of climate change and some of the issues that you have outlined. I find it very interesting that you didn't mention the question of population. There are those whose fundamental concern about all these issues, particularly regarding Africa, is overpopulation. They see overpopulation as the central driver of climate crisis, and they often point to Africa. They argue, for instance, that Africa needs to drastically reduce its birth rate. Nigeria alone is predicted to have a population of about 800 million by 2010. So the argument of this class of people is that if you don't do something about overpopulation, then you cannot address this crisis. So how do you respond to that?
First, I don't even think that it's a valid argument in any way. Let's begin by saying that our population today is a strength in the sense that we have possibly the youngest regional population. and that's a plus. That's a major plus. And the mere fact that you have large numbers is not necessarily a disadvantage, especially if you put the large numbers to use and you put them to use in a positive way. And I think that what we will find is that going by some of what we have been talking about, especially the pathways that we've been talking about, I think that it's entirely possible for us to put the population of our continent to good use, not just in the various ways we've talked about, the green manufacturing opportunities that are going to be presented, the carbon removal technologies, the various opportunities that will be presented. So frankly, I'm not sure that I mean, for instance, today we have 1.3 billion. The whole of the African continent is 1.3 billion. How does that compare with China alone or India alone? So really, I'm not sure that that's a very substantial argument. I think that the way to look at this is what are the advantages of having the population? I'm not so sure that population growth by itself, is any kind of answer to carbon emissions. By the way, despite our population growth, we are by far the least emitters of carbon, by far. Even if we were to add, if we were to double our populations by 2050, and using energy in the way that we're using it today, we'll still be way behind in terms of emissions. So perhaps the point that should be made is how come such a small number of people are contributing to the destruction of the world? And this large number of people, and what you're saying is, this large number of people just stop growing, whereas a very small number in relative terms is, responsible for the global emissions that we see and the difficulty that the world has found itself today.
A subset of that argument is that because of the crisis in the continent, there will be huge, challenges of population migration from Africa to the West, where they would then contribute to greater emission in the West or elsewhere in the world where they go. So how do you respond to that?
Well, frankly, I don't even think that I think the point we're making, and this is really the point about this grand bargain, is that Africa is the place where these new investments can be made, especially because we won't have legacy infrastructure and because of all the natural endowments. So I think that answers the question about migration. If the investments are made, as we've spoken about them and the way that we've spoken about them, the migration argument doesn't even, it wouldn't arise, because that population will be very well put to use with well-paying jobs in the various areas that we've spoken about. So I don't think that it would necessarily pose a difficulty, except, of course, if we simply ignore all of the various opportunities that we've spoken about.
Okay. What do you think is the role of the United States in this? Because if you look at the debate going on even within the United States about climate change, with quite a substantial percentage of the population being climate deniers, and the argument by some people that it's important to have a central leadership position for the United States in this whole process that you are describing, but in the context of the challenges within the United States in terms of the climate deniers and all of that. So do you think that the United States is in a good position to be able to take the leadership role in this conversation and the measures that need to be taken?
I think, especially, I think in the past few years, especially under the current administration, the current U.S. administration, those of us involved in the climate change conversations are relatively happier, of course, with the role that the United States is playing. And we think, especially after the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the significant expenditure that has gone into climate change issues, that's positive. That's a good thing. And we think that role can be further expanded, into looking at some of the issues that we're talking about, especially significant investments in renewable energy in Africa. And we think that that's also something that ought to be taken into account. Not as a palliative of any sort, not as some kind of remedy for climate justice or whatever, but as a commercial, as a sensible commercial approach to resolving the problems of climate change ultimately. Because really, I mean, Africa is the solution. And if the right investments are made today, that could significantly change the narrative on climate change.
One of the biggest challenges that Africa faces in this context is deforestation. It's regarded as one of the key factors harming the ecological balance of the entire planet. So the outcomes of the clearance of forest cover for timber and agricultural land include, climate change, soil erosion, decreased rainfall, among others. So the production of cocoa and palm oil alone has had devastating effects on the continent's forests. Given that nearly 3/4 of the world's cocoa is produced in 4 African countries, while the continent accounts for 24% of the world's palm oil production, do you think the continent can address the problem of deforestation in the context of this reality?
I think it's entirely possible. The point, of course, is that is management. The point is management. And I think that if we start from the premise that we want a system where we're replacing, for instance, today, deforestation, a lot of it is on account of just cooking, firewood, charcoal, etc. That's one of the major causes. Now, how do we resolve that? The clean cooking, the stoves, the biofuel stoves that I was talking about in Kenya is one. Using LPG cooking stoves in Nigeria is another. I mean, so one of the significant problems today of deforestation is just on account of the fact that large numbers of our people still use firewood, and that we can reduce almost to zero if we focus on using clean cooking stoves, either just solar-powered clean cooking stoves or LPG stoves. That would significantly improve the situation. I don't think that it presents that much of a problem if you compare how to solve it to what the solution really is and the cost of doing so. I don't think so. And I think a lot of the research that's been done clearly shows that if we were to spend, the kind of money we're spending today just on mitigation efforts, if we were to spend that, invest that in clean cooking stoves or just even in clean cooking stoves, we'll resolve a lot of these issues and resolve a lot of the problems, which is really the point. Africa offers the best carbon sinks. Our forests are bigger just in terms of their role as carbon sinks for the rest of the world. They are much bigger than any other region of the world. We need to preserve those carbon sinks. But then the existential challenges for Africa. People need to farm. They need to, So if you're going to say, don't do this, or reduce this, or let us preserve these carbon sinks, then we have to make the investments. You have to make the investments. If those investments are not made, then it's completely logical for African countries to say, well, we also have to pursue our path to development. Our path to development will be as damaging as your path to development. And that's not really an argument we should be having today.
So who is going to pay for this?
Oh, the global north, the wealthier countries of the world. And they're not paying. You see, if you say paying for it, it almost sounds like it's a handout. No. This is a commercial proposition. A commercial proposition to save the world, to save our planet. So we're all working together. There are carbon sinks. We want to preserve those carbon sinks. There are renewable energy initiatives, and we need to be able to invest in them. So if I have the carbon sinks and you have the financing, then we have a commercial agreement. So when you say pay for it, it does sound a little, but that's not the point. The point is that this is a commercial proposition.
Yeah, I'm putting in it within the context of neoliberal logic. The question is always, that's a great idea, so who pays? And that's why I was asking that question.
No. Again, just as you point out, a neoliberal logic has its failings. I don't think the question really should be who is going to pay for it. The question is, this is a bargain, So, I make this proposal, and you come in with your own end of the bargain. So it works well for both of us and works well for the world.
Let's move to a couple of other issues. Recently at a lecture in London, you stated, and I'm quoting you, most African countries are rightly unapologetic about their close ties with China. China shows up where and when the West will not or are reluctant. And many African countries are of the view that the beware of the Chinese Trojan loans advice from the West is wise, but probably self-serving. Africa needs the loans and the infrastructure, and China offers them, unquote. So, Mr. Vice President, China is not Father Christmas. Some will disagree with you and add that China's imprint all over the continent is another form of colonization. There are those who make the argument. And the long-term implications of indebtedness to China and Africa's use value, to use that phrase, within the context of China's own geostrategic interest, would appear to be debilitating in the future, not only for Africa, but also to the cause of human freedom and global peace. So how would you react to this?
Well, let me start by saying that the borrowing world always needed an alternative to the Bretton Woods institutions. We always needed that alternative. So if the only lenders that we have are, the global North countries, the Bretton Woods institutions, and commercial banks in the West, then we would have the sorts of problems that we've had. I mean, for instance, look at the debris of the SAPs, the structural adjustment policies of the World Bank and IMF. I mean, the debris is everywhere. Obviously, a completely failed policy. But we had no choice. Now there is a choice. China offers a choice. So because there is a choice, that's better for competition, isn't it? I mean, I would have thought that that's the sort of thing that everyone would be happy about. At least we have some competition now. Now, that competitor, as you rightly point out, is not Father Christmas. So we must still have, and this is really the point, we must still have our wits about us. We must negotiate these loans properly. We can't afford to simply walk into these loans and say, well, these are nice-looking loans. No. These are commercially agreed loans anyway, except that they are, good concessional loans, low interest rates and all that. But they offer an alternative. And they are, and the procedures for getting them are far less, they're just far less complex than some of the Bretton Woods institutions. So this has worked well for us, and it's provided infrastructure. So you have roads, you have rail in many parts of Africa that have come as a result of these loans. Now, which is a very good thing, by the way, because if I have a railroad from Nairobi to Mombasa, you can't just come one day and take the railroad away. You can't. It's going to be there. So we will talk about paying back, and that's important to do because otherwise you won't get further credit. But this is a very good thing indeed, that we're able to get concessional loans from some other entities other than Western, financial institutions. And the competition is good. By the way, if you look at what happened, especially just post-COVID, with the DSSI initiative, the debt suspension initiatives. What happened there was that China had to step in, despite the fact that China had much fewer loans than everyone else. China stepped in to save the day. So China itself is coming to the table, and saying, look, we are part of this responsible community of nations working on the development of the world, and we're interested also in what becomes of everyone. And I think that the role that they've played has been, largely a salutary one, and it's worked well so far for us. Of course, there are those who say, "Oh, beware of the Chinese." Yes, we've got to be aware of everyone. You beware of every lender, not just the Chinese, every lender, right?
Let's go to Nigeria briefly. President Muhammadu Buhari and yourself were elected to office in 2015 with unprecedented goodwill, both locally and internationally. Preliminary judgments on how the administration has performed in the last 8 years are quite dismal in many quarters within Nigeria and outside. So when you look at it from security, the point of view of security, the area of infrastructure, the state of the economy, the debt crisis, social anomie, that are pushing, all of these factors pushing many Nigerians to want to leave the country, what they call Japa, so in Nigeria now. What do you think happened to the promise of the Buhari administration?
Well, let me start by saying that just in terms of what is promised and what is delivered, I think that you will, for instance, if you look at debt, I think that debt is something that's been positive because it has led to increased infrastructure. So today we have the second Niger Bridge, which, as you know, was obviously in the ambition for years and years and years. We have the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. We have the Abuja-Kaduna-Kano road that will be completed soon. And we have several other infrastructural developments on account of debt. So debt by itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is a very good thing, especially if you're using it for development, if you're using it for infrastructure. So today it may look like, oh, we owe so much. But tomorrow it is the basis for development. And it's the same issue coming to the questions of renewable energy and all that. Very significant investment has gone into renewable energy. A lot of money is going into renewable energy. So that's also important. And I must say that, when you look at it, yes, there are challenges and there continue to be challenges with security. But look at what the Northeast was like, 2014, 2015.
It's gotten worse.
Northeast. No. The Northeast?
Yes.
No. Let me explain what the Northeast was like. So the Northeast in 2015, before we came into office, don't forget that that's Maiduguri, that's Borno.
Yes.
Borno had almost 27 towns that were completely occupied by Boko Haram and ISWAP. Today, that's not the case. Don't forget that it was in 2014 that the UN building was bombed in Abuja. Kaduna, several mosques were bombed. Kano, several churches and mosques. It is within our lifetime that we see people able to go and pray in their mosques in the Northeast. That does not mean that there isn't a challenge in the Northwest. Oh, there are. But in the Northeast, that's been resolved. So I think that, there are benefits, there are burdens, there are significant issues. But this is the general run of development.
Okay, I would not want to belabor the point because we could go on this. You were a law professor and prominent attorney for many years before you became vice president. What surprised you most about human nature and Nigeria in the last 8 years?
Well, I'm not so sure that there were any real surprises about human nature. I think that I'm 66 years old now, so a few surprises, about human nature. I think I've seen quite a bit. So I don't think I've seen much by way of, I didn't see much by way of surprises in human nature, no.
What about the country?
Well, I think one of the issues I thought was really with questions around ethnicity and religion and the role that ethnicity and religion plays in our politics. I think that that's a significant drawback. I think that we could do a lot better, and I think the elite, political leadership, religious leadership, and even the business elite could do a lot more in terms of strengthening the bonds that keep us together as a country, as opposed to, the fault lines, which politicians very frequently tend to take advantage of. So frankly, my view is that the political elite could do a lot more, and I don't think that we've done as much as we could, just in terms of ensuring that we keep the country together with all the diversity and all the cultural differences. Yes.
Mr. Vice President, John Adams, that's America's first vice president and later the second president, described the vice presidency as, and I quote him, the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived or his imagination conceived. If you had another life, would you want to be vice president again?
Most certainly I would. I think it's a tremendous honor to be vice president in Nigeria. I mean, my country, I think, is a tremendous honor. And frankly, I do not necessarily agree with John Adams. And I think he operated, of course, as you know, within a completely different time and also a completely different geostructure and all of that. I don't think that he's right. For example, in Nigeria, maybe even unlike several countries, the vice president has specific responsibilities. For example, the vice president is the chairman of the National Economic Council, which is a meeting of the 36 governors of the states every month to advise on issues of the economy, etc. And again, chairman of the Economic Sustainability Committee in our case, and several other statutory and constitutional roles, unlike the US, where there is no such specification. So I can understand John Adams' frustration, but certainly that's not the case with us. It's not the case with us.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Mr. Vice President. We'll open it up now to the audience. Please raise your hand if you've got a question, and the mic will come. Okay, let's start from the back. Please keep your questions short and not, give a lecture.
Your Excellency,
Yeah.
Professor Yemi Osinbajo, welcome to the City of Liberation, Philadelphia. My name is Sheyi Adesoya. I am a microbiologist, environmental, and I'm happy being here this day. I was a lecturer in Olabisi Onabanjo University and Redeemers University before I came here. I am particularly happy for this lecture. It talks about climate change, the effects, which you have enumerated. It has a lot of devastating effects, on, the country, globally, as well. Now, what we do when we try to talk about finding solutions to environmental issues.
Can you please ask the question?
I'm coming. Is to try. I am a lecturer, and the Prof too was a lecturer, and like we used to say, Now, yes. Now, preservation of the human race is what we try to do. But I am particularly interested in preservation of the general human race and, of course, my own race. Now, some of the effects of climate change is we see a movement.
Excuse me.
Movement of.
Excuse me. Can you please ask the question? You have 1 minute, please. 1 minute. 1 minute. Please let him ask the question. Okay, thank you. Can you hold on, please? Can everyone please sit down? We do not have as much time for so many questions, I will identify the people that will ask, will call some people to ask questions. Can you please sit down? Please sit down. The lady who has the mic should ask the question. The others should please sit down.
Okay.
As you understand, we do have, limited time. I cannot take everyone. Yes, go ahead, please.
Good evening, Your Excellency. My name is Nandi. I'm an undergrad student, and I really appreciated everything you said about the framework. I found it fascinating. Do you feel like the international community is kind of in agreement with you? What kind of responses have you gotten from other world leaders? I just wanted to know that.
Thank you. Can you go to, come here, at the back here? Is the microphone here? Is there another microphone here?
Oh,
Okay.
did you hear her name? I didn't hear her name.
What's the name? The lady who just asked? Nandi. Yes.
Good evening, I'm Chinelo. My question is, do you support the law that condemns homosexuals in Nigeria to how many years? 14 years. And if your answer is yes, why? And if you had a child who was gay, would you send the child abroad, or would you let the person be condemned to 14 years?
Thank you. One more. Can you give the guy in tie in front here in tie?
Thank you so much. Good evening, Your Excellency. My name is Uyi. My question is, considering the fact that Africa will contribute 2 to 3% of global emission, do you think climate finance can, address these climate injustice? And secondly, what do you think Nigeria as a country can do to address this issue? What policies do we have in place to support, renewable energy and address climate change?
Thank you. We'll take this set of questions. We'll come back.
My name is Uyi Oni.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. I think Nandi asked the question, is the international community in agreement with some of the points that I have raised, or the framework for climate positive growth for Africa? I think the engagement is on, the conversations are on, and I think the indications are good generally. I think that we all sort of agree on, common issues such as the need for us to perhaps take a different pathway to resolving the global ambitions for net zero by 2050 and all of that, and what role Africa could play. Now, again, there's so many moving parts, and I think that the real issue is how these are resolved in the months and years to come. So I think that the indications are good, and frankly, I am greatly encouraged by a lot of the interactions that I've had, internationally. I think there's a lot of interest, at least in some of the ideas around climate positive growth for Africa. Chinelo was interested in knowing what my views are on same-sex marriage, I believe it was, because that's the law in Nigeria. It's not a law on homosexuality, it's a law on same-sex marriage. The law, let me say first that I'm a Democrat, and I strongly believe that the world, that the way our nations are run, must depend, and we must be able to trust our legislators, must be able to trust them. If the majority of them take a certain socio-cultural view and legislate in those terms, then we must live with that. That's the whole point of democracy. And let me just say something. For example, today, it is an offense in the United Kingdom and in the USA for a man to marry 2 wives or for a woman to marry 2 husbands, despite the fact that this is between consenting adults. As a matter of fact, if you were in England and you were to marry 2 wives, you'd probably go to jail for 7 years. And in many parts of the US, in states in the US, it is still an offense. Polygamy is still an offense. Polyandry is still an offense, despite the fact that this is between consenting adults. And this is the whole point of democracy. This is legislation. This is the socio-cultural beliefs of the people and reflected by their legislators. So that's the basic position I take. The other is the question we said, will climate finance affect, in what ways will climate finance contribute to our development? And I think that we certainly need climate finance, because, and we present, in my view, an incontestable case for climate finance. We have the carbon sinks, we have the natural resources, and climate finance will help a great deal. It will also help the whole global, it will also help the whole net zero by 2050 or by 2060 if you're a Nigerian. It will help that whole cause. So I think climate finance is absolutely important for Africa, and I think that we make a good case for it, just simply by the evidence that's available. Okay, so that's it.
Yes. Can you, the lady behind you, in front of you rather.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Vice President. My name is Monda Mwaya, and I'm from Malawi. I have a question. So you talk about encouraging people to use different kind of energy. There's a project currently in Malawi that they're trying to get people to use the stoves you had mentioned. But the people don't use those kind of energies. They collect the stoves and they put them away. So what kind of incentives do you have to encourage the local people to turn away from using trees, cutting down trees, and helping them focus on clean energy? Thank you.
The guy at the back, yes. Yes, you, yes.
Thank you, sir. My name is Richard, and first I want to thank the Center for Africana Studies for putting up this wonderful lecture. Your Excellency, so looking at the data, Africa only emits about 3.8% of global emissions. China emits about over 27%. Now, the situation appears to be that Western countries are actually paying China to emit more because you have many companies in China operating there and manufacturing. So thinking about this, why would, for instance, the international community be interested in negotiating or bargaining with Africa first, even before China, given that we don't emit that much? And secondly, also thinking about it, I'm wondering if you think that Africa is also kind of putting the cart before the horse, since if, for instance, we don't have a strong consumption of energy, which would appear to the international community that, okay, because this is very high, then we need to talk to these people, to emit less. Then we don't have a strong anchor on which we can actually bargain with the international community. So how do we solve that? Thank you.
The lady at the back there. Oh, okay. Oh, your hand is no longer up. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, the guy beside you there. Okay. Sorry.
Hi, Your Excellency. Thank you so much for coming. You talked about the complexity of Western loans and precisely IMF. Do you think that complexity sort of scrutinizes the bankability of our projects in Nigeria? For example, if you look at the railway connecting, I think, Lagos to Kaduna, there was a report that that project generated a revenue of 11 billion. However, just for debt service, we spent 112 billion. So do you think if that project was financed by the IMF, for example, such issues will not come up because that project clearly is not bankable. And when you talk about just energy transition, what policies do we have in place to actually enable or to propel a just energy transition? If you look at, like Prof said, when you took over office in 2015, we vote, beyond party lines, right? But if you look at where we are today, inflation is at about 18% or thereabout, 21% rather. Unemployment is 41%. Our debt has moved from 9 trillion to 77 trillion. Insecurity is a thing. You can't actually, we've never seen in Nigeria this divisive in my whole life. So do you think...
Young life.
So do you think in terms of, because one thing I believe is, one thing is capital will always, good returns will always attract capital. So I don't think we need to even beg the Western world to invest in Africa if we actually have bankable renewable energy projects in Africa. Currency devaluation.
Sorry, I'm trying to follow you, so if you just slow down a bit. Okay. Go on.
All right, so my point is, why do we ask the West to, why do we beg the West in that sense to provide capital for infrastructure development in Africa, where generally we expect that capital will always chase returns? So do we have the policy in place to actually attract that capital for a just energy transition?
Okay, can you, the guy at the back?
I didn't get it.
My name is Adedayo Abib. I work in a nuclear plant in the United States. Nigeria has got whatever it takes to produce electricity to the whole of West Africa, in terms of gas, in terms of wind, in terms of water. I'm not going to talk about nuclear energy. But what plans do Nigeria is planning as regards the grid system? The grid system is you produce your electricity. You want to distribute to the whole country. What are the plans that the country has in plan?
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Vice President.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. I think, yes, it was Monda who started with encouraging that there are people, many people, especially in the rural areas, don't want to use some of the clean energy initiatives that there are, and they would rather their old ways. I think a lot of advocacy needs to be done. That's always an initial problem, because obviously people prefer to do what they used to do. But once the advocacy is good and people see it's such an obviously preferable way of doing stuff, and it's so much faster. And what we found is that offtake has been tremendous so long as you're able to do the right advocacy, show people how it works, show people how the LPG stoves work, show them how the biofuels work. It is so intuitive. There is no, I don't think that if advocacy is done properly and people actually see these things work, they'll just rather use them because it's so much easier than going to go and wait until cut trees down and then wait until the wood gets dry and all of that, when you can very quickly use some of these technologies. So I think it might be a failing in advocacy, and if that is done well, it should produce the right results. The question, I didn't get the name of the gentleman who asked the question about why the international community should prefer Africa to China, and because if projects are bankable, there's no need to ask for. No, I think you missed the point slightly. We're not merely talking about bankability of projects. That is an important feature. But we're saying that can the world itself, can the world as it is, meet its global emissions targets without doing something about investing in renewables in Africa. So it's a much broader question than just bankability of projects. The projects become bankable, and I gave the example, for instance, of anchor demand for renewable energy, and that anchor demand comes from industry, from industrial deployment, and that is not one or the other. So it's not. So I think the major question that we need to ask is it possible for the world to ignore the proposition that Africa presents the best case for green, for a green civilization, for green manufacturing, and to invest in that, as opposed to much more expensive investments in any other approaches? I think that that's the point. I don't think it comes. I think the question of bankability is really, it answers itself. If you think that this is the way that, if you think that this is the best way to solve an existential problem for the world, then you make it bankable. You work on it. You just, and I've given the reasons why this will be bankable. Look at lithium, for example. Look at processing of lithium. Or just a few years ago, someone would come, take lithium, export raw lithium. But we now have lithium processing plants, right? And look at bauxite, which I talked about, bauxite and aluminum. Just by local processing of bauxite to aluminum rather than exporting raw bauxite, look at how much you save just in terms of emissions. So if we're going to meet the global targets, the examples are practical. They are very practical and they're demonstrable. And the reason why they are bankable is exactly because this is the pathway that the world will take to resolving an existential issue. So that's my response to that. I think that's I think is a question on that. I think I wanted to ask, Nigeria has what it takes to produce electricity for West African countries. What are we doing about the grid system? Well, I think that it's evident that we need to have independent grids and that we cannot have the single national grid. And what you find now is that there's a much greater focus on mini grids and off-grid capacity. And we also realize that we cannot have, for instance, the projections now is that we may need 3 zonal grids, right? And aside from the other mini grids here and there, and of course the off-grid capacity that we're developing. So we're not going to be pursuing a track of one national grid. I think that the wisdom today is that we're going to have to use several other grids. But the problem with capacity, with electricity capacity, aside from the grid, which of course is a transmission issue, we also have problems with gas, with the cost of gas, right? And we're trying to resolve that because the cost of gas relative to tariffs, people, of course, do not want to pay, the kinds of cost-reflective tariffs that the market expects. So there have been subsidies and all of that. But we have to come to a regime where, tariffs reflect the real costs of gas and the real costs of the entire value chain. So those are, some of the challenges aside from the grid.
Thank you very much. We have to stop now because our time is up. I will have to invite my colleague, Professor Tukufo Subiru, to come and thank the Vice President. Can you please join me?
Did I deliver? I promised. A wonderful conversation, and the Center for Africans. Oh wait, I had one announcement. The people with the red armbands, you should exit throughout this door right here. Red armbands, exit out of that door right there. On behalf of the Center for Africana Studies, I wanted to present this small token of our appreciation to the Vice President and thank him for his participation in this conversation, but for gracing us with his comments and his wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So please join me in thanking both my colleague Wale and the Vice President for such a wonderful conversation.
We also have a gift. We also have a gift for you. In true Nigerian hospitality, we also have a gift for you. So this is from us to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tukufu. Mr. Vice President, sir, they want some photos. Yes, sir.
Nigeria.
On the mountain, shouted in the valley, Nigeria has come a long, long way.
On a journey to our future
Of brighter and better days.
Together we will make it strong and invincible. We are on our way. Oh yeah.
one nation indefeasible.
Nigeria is here to stay.
We are standing tall as a nation.
Standing tall
Through adversity.
we are one. 100 years. Nigeria, we will stand. Standing tall. We're still together.
One nation. One country.